The envelope hit the table between them like a gunshot, and Perry Hartwell did not reach for it. Cornelius Vance, a man whose suit cost more than most cowboys earned in a year, leaned across the polished oak desk with the kind of smile that had never once meant anything good. The oil lamp on the desk threw jagged shadows across his face, and outside the window of his Abilene office, the Kansas wind howled like something wounded and wild. $50,000, Vance said. Cash. You ride out of Kansas tonight, you forget her name, and every debt you ever carried disappears before sunrise. Perry stared at the envelope. He could see the corner of the bills inside. He had never in his life seen $50 in one place, let alone 50,000. His father had worked himself into an early grave for far less. His mother had sewn dresses by candlelight for pennies. $50,000 was a number that belonged to a different world entirely, a world where men like Cornelius Vance built railroads on the backs of men like Perry Hartwell. "You think I can be bought," Perry said. His voice was low and flat and very dangerous. "Every man can be bought," Vance replied pleasantly. "The only question is the price." Perry picked up his hat from the chair beside him, turned it once in his hands the way he always did when he was holding something back, and then set it back down. He looked up at Vance with eyes the color of river water after a storm. "3 months ago," Perry said slowly, "I made a promise to Alice Quinn. I gave her my word in front of God and whatever else was listening. That promise wasn't conditional on your comfort, your railroad, or your money." Vance's smile thinned. "That woman is going to cost you everything." "Then everything it is," Perry said, and stood up from the chair. He walked out of Cornelius Vance's office without touching the envelope, and the door closed behind him with a quiet click that somehow felt louder than any door he had ever shut in his life. The night air hit him like cold water, full of horses and wood smoke, and the distant sound of a piano being played badly in the saloon 2 streets over. He stood on the boardwalk for a long moment, breathing it in. $50,000. He could hear it sitting on that table behind him, whispering. A ranch of his own, a horse bred right, a life without wondering whether next winter would finally break him, all of it gone now. And the only thing standing between him and that fortune was a promise he had made to a woman he had known for exactly 94 days. A woman whose name he had learned on a raw October morning in 1874, when the stage from St. Louis pulled into Clearwater, Texas, and Alice Quinn stepped down into the dust like she had been sent there by someone who understood exactly what Perry Hartwell needed, and had decided to make his life considerably more complicated. He started walking back toward the hotel where she was waiting, and the whole story came back to him, the way stories always did, not in order, but in the pieces that mattered most. Clearwater, Texas, was not a town that inspired confidence. It sat on the edge of the high plains like something that had been dropped there by accident and had not yet found the energy to move. The main street was unpaved, the sheriff was largely decorative, and the general store sold 3 kinds of flour and a startling number of patent medicines. It had a church, a livery, a saloon called the Red Ace, and a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Opal Dunning, who made the best biscuits in the county and charged accordingly. Perry had been working the Dunbar Ranch for 2 years when he first saw Alice Quinn. He was 30 years old, lean and weathered and possessed of the quiet self-sufficiency of a man who had learned early that the world did not particularly care whether you survived it. He had grown up in Missouri, the second son of a farmer who drank too much and a mother who prayed too hard, and he had come west at 17 with a horse, a rifle, and the vague conviction that a man could make himself into something better than what he had been handed. He had not, in 2 years at the Dunbar Ranch, particularly distinguished himself as a romantic prospect. He was good with horses, better with cattle, and had a reputation for being the kind of man you wanted beside you in bad weather. He was also deeply private in a way that some women found intriguing and most found simply discouraging. He had been crossing the street with a coil of rope over his shoulder when the stage stopped and the door opened. Alice Quinn stepped down and squinted into the October sun, with the expression of a woman who had expected things to be difficult and had prepared accordingly. She was 24 years old, with dark brown hair pinned up under a travel-worn hat and eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green that Perry would later spend a disproportionate amount of time thinking about. She wore a brown wool traveling dress that had seen better days, and she carried a small leather trunk and a canvas bag with the careful determination of someone who had learned not to wait for help. She looked around Clearwater, Texas, and something crossed her face that Perry recognized immediately, because he had felt it himself on his first day in this country. It was the look of a person calculating exactly how much harder this was going to be than they had imagined, and deciding that it did not matter because there was no going back. He kept walking. He had a fence to fix before sundown. But at the well, 2 minutes later, he found her struggling with the pump handle, the mechanism stuck in the dry October way that it always was, and the leather trunk balanced precariously on the rim in a way that guaranteed it was going to fall in about 30 seconds. Perry set down his rope and fixed the pump in approximately 45 seconds, retrieved her trunk from its dangerous position on the rim, and handed her the first clean bucket of water without saying a single word about it. She looked at him directly, which was something he noticed because a lot of people did not meet his eyes. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was clear and unhurried. "I'm Alice Quinn. I'm here to interview for the schoolteacher position." "Perry Hartwell," he said. "Dunbar Ranch." He picked up his rope. "Is there a school?" she asked, looking up the street with what he now recognized as the tactical assessment of someone mapping a new territory. "Buildings there," he said. "Students are intermittent." She nodded, as though this were a reasonable answer to a reasonable question, and thanked him again, and he walked away with his rope and the sensation that something had just shifted in the landscape of his life in a way he did not yet have the words to describe. Alice Quinn got the teaching position. The town council, consisting of 3 ranchers, the storekeeper and the pastor, interviewed her on a Friday afternoon and offered her the job before she had finished answering their second question, because the last teacher had left in June to marry a man in Fort Worth, and the children of Clearwater had spent the intervening months in a state of cheerful educational anarchy. She moved into a room at Mrs. Dunning's boarding house and started school on Monday. Perry did not see her again for 2 weeks. He was occupied with the autumn roundup, which consumed every waking hour and a significant portion of what should have been sleeping ones. When he finally came back to town for supplies in early November, he was trail dirty and tired in the particular way that made small talk feel like an act of violence. He was at the general store when he heard her. She was arguing with Jonas Pratt, the storekeeper, about the price of chalk and paper. Not aggressively, but with a precise and unyielding logic that had old Jonas red-faced and slightly bewildered, because he was not accustomed to being out-argued about anything in his own store. "The school is a public institution supported by the town charter," Alice was saying, her voice pleasant and inflexible as river rock. "The charter specifies that basic educational materials are to be supplied at cost. I have a copy of the charter, which I am happy to leave with you to read at your convenience. In the meantime, I would like 12 pieces of chalk and 2 reams of paper at the rate specified therein." Jonas looked at Perry in the doorway with the expression of a man appealing to a higher court. Perry looked at the items on the counter and back at Jonas and said, "She's right. I've read the charter." He had not, in fact, read the charter, but he had a strong suspicion she was correct, and a stronger suspicion that Jonas had been overcharging the school for years. Alice turned to look at him. There was a brief moment of recognition and then something that was not quite a smile but was warmer than neutral. "Mr. Hartwell." "Miss Quinn," he said, and moved to look at the nails he needed. But Jonas bagged her chalk and paper at the correct price, and when Alice passed Perry on her way out, she said quietly, "Thank you again." "You had it handled," he said, which was true. She paused at the door. "I almost never need rescuing," she said, "but I don't object to reinforcements." He thought about that sentence for the rest of the afternoon. November in Clearwater was a complicated month. The weather turned sharp, and the nights grew long, and the high plains wind found every gap in every building in town with a kind of personal commitment. Perry came into town more often than strictly necessary, and it took him a while to admit to himself that this was connected to the new schoolteacher. He started attending Sunday services for the first time in 3 years, which caused enough comment among the Dunbar Ranch hands that he had to be quietly firm about the fact that it was nobody's business. He did not sit near her in the church. He was not that obvious. But he was aware of where she was in the room with the kind of peripheral accuracy that he usually reserved for tracking cattle in bad weather. They talked, in the way that people in small towns always eventually talk, because proximity and repetition are the engines of most human connection. He helped her carry books from the stage when a crate of donated readers arrived from a church in Wichita. She asked him about the ranch and listened to his answers the way most people did not, with the focused patience of someone who was genuinely trying to understand. He discovered that she had come from St. Louis, where she had been living with an aunt after the death of her parents 4 years earlier. Her father had been a schoolteacher himself, and her mother had been a pianist of some local reputation. She had trained to teach, because it was a skill she could carry anywhere, and she had answered the advertisement for the Clearwater position because she had wanted to see the West, and because her aunt, while kind, had a particular and suffocating vision of what Alice's life should look like that involved a certain Mr. Gerald Potts, an accountant, and a future that made Alice feel, she said with a small and precise frankness, like something slowly calcifying. "What does that mean?" he asked. They were sitting on the fence outside the livery on a Wednesday afternoon in late November, both temporarily at a loose end. "It means," she said, "that I felt myself hardening around something that wasn't really me, becoming the shape of something I hadn't chosen." He thought about his father's farm and the slow, inexorable logic of a life laid out in front of you before you were old enough to want something different. "I understand that," he said. She looked at him sideways. "I thought you might." That was the moment, Perry would later decide. Not dramatic, not particularly visible to anyone who might have been watching. Just two people on a fence in November recognizing something true about each other, and the quiet, irreversible shift that followed. December arrived, and with it came trouble, because trouble in the Texas high plains did not wait on convenient timing. The trouble had a name: Warren Vance. 23 years old, son of Cornelius Vance, who controlled most of the railroad land grants in this part of Kansas and a significant portion of Texas, and who had recently established an operation in Clearwater for reasons that were nominally about cattle buying, but were actually about buying land at prices that reflected force rather than value. Warren Vance rode into Clearwater with 3 men who were paid to be intimidating and did their jobs with professional efficiency. He took a room at the boarding house because it was the only option available, and within 48 hours, he had made his interest in Alice Quinn apparent in the particular way of men who were accustomed to getting what they wanted and had no experience with the alternative. Perry heard about it from Mrs. Dunning, who was not a gossip but who understood clearly when information needed to travel. "He's persistent," Mrs. Dunning said, setting a plate of biscuits in front of Perry with the gravity of a woman delivering a dispatch. "Called on her twice yesterday. She was polite about declining both times. He doesn't appear to be a man who accepts polite." Perry finished his coffee and put on his hat. He was not going to do anything dramatic. He was not the kind of man who made scenes, but he was going to be present because presence was sometimes the entire argument. He found Alice coming out of the schoolhouse at 4 in the afternoon, and Warren Vance was indeed waiting at the gate with the practiced ease of someone who knew that waiting was a form of pressure. He was a handsome young man in the way that money and certainty can make a person handsome, but his eyes were cold in a way that his smile did not quite cover. Perry stopped beside Alice at a distance that was close enough to communicate something without requiring any words. Vance looked at him. "Hartwell," he said, because men in small towns knew each other's names the way fences know their posts. "Mr. Vance," Perry said, nothing else, just standing there. It was Alice who handled it naturally. She thanked Warren Vance for his interest, told him clearly and without meanness that she was not available for the calls he had been making, and bid him good evening. Then she walked with Perry toward Mrs. Dunning's boarding house and said nothing until they were around the corner. "You did not have to come," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I'm glad you did," she said. Not because I needed it, but because she stopped, seemed to be selecting words with care, because it mattered that you came. He understood the distinction she was making. She was not asking to be rescued. She was noting that he had showed up and that this meant something. "I'll always show up," he said. It came out more simply and more absolutely than he had intended, and he heard it himself with a slight internal shock because it was completely true. She looked at him then in the fading winter light, with those gray-green eyes that he had been thinking about for 6 weeks, and something between them became definitively different. They started spending deliberate time together after that. Sunday afternoons walking the edge of town. The evenings when he was in Clearwater and she was not yet needed at the schoolhouse. He was not a talkative man by nature, but with her he found that there was always something worth saying, and more than that, she seemed to understand the value of the silences between the words, did not fill them with noise the way some people did. She was teaching herself Spanish from a grammar book she had ordered from a bookshop in San Antonio, because several of her students' families spoke Spanish at home, and she had decided this was inadequate preparation on her part. He had enough working Spanish from years of range work to help her with pronunciation, and this became one of their regular activities, sitting at the table in the parlor of Mrs. Dunning's boarding house on cold evenings while she practiced verb conjugations and he corrected her vowels. He told her things he had never told anyone, about his father, about the specific quality of his childhood loneliness, about the year at 17 when he had ridden west with nothing and the way that had felt simultaneously like falling and like flying, because it had been terrifying and it had been his, entirely and only his, and no one could take the choosing of it from him. She told him about her mother's piano playing, about the way her father had read to her every night until she was 12, and how after his death she had sometimes opened a book and found the ghost of his voice in every sentence, about the calcifying feeling in St. Louis, and the way stepping off the stage in Clearwater had felt like breathing for the first time in 2 years, even though she had been standing in dust and the wind had been vicious and she had had no idea what she was doing. "Were you afraid?" he asked. "Constantly," she said, without hesitation. "But that's not the same thing as being stopped." He thought about that for a long time. Christmas came to Clearwater with a thin layer of snow that the wind redistributed into drifts and patches in its usual arbitrary way. The church held a service, and Mrs. Dunning made a dinner that defied all reasonable expectations for her budget, and the schoolchildren performed a nativity play that Alice had directed with the same focused precision she brought to everything, and Perry stood at the back of the church watching her watch her students with an expression that he recognized was probably visible to anyone who happened to look, and decided that he did not particularly care. Warren Vance had not given up. He had simply changed tactics, moving from direct attention to the kind of persistent background presence that was harder to object to, appearing at public events, making himself agreeable to the town council, ingratiating himself with Mrs. Dunning by being an extremely good boarder who paid promptly and complimented her cooking with sincerity. Perry watched this and felt the particular cold discomfort of understanding that the competition was not nothing. Warren Vance had money and a name, and the kind of easy confidence that came from never having doubted his own value. Perry had a good horse and a reputation for reliability and a growing certainty that he was in love with Alice Quinn in the serious, permanent way that reorganizes a person. He had not told her this. He was still turning it over, looking at it from different angles, checking it for the quality of his reasoning the way he checked a rope for wear. The conversation that changed things happened in January, on a night when the temperature dropped hard and fast, and the wind off the plains was the kind that made indoor life feel like a moral achievement. He had come to town with a supply run and stayed later than expected, and found himself in the parlor of the boarding house with Alice and a fire that was doing its best. She had been reading student papers and he had been oiling a bridle, and they had been sitting in comfortable silence for an hour when she said, without looking up, "Perry, what do you want in the future? What do you actually want?" He put down the bridle. He thought about it honestly. "A ranch of my own," he said. "Not big. Just enough land to work and not be beholden to someone else's schedule. A place that's mine." He paused. "A family." She looked up from the papers. "I'm not talking around anything," he said. "I mean exactly what I'm saying." She held his gaze for a moment that lasted considerably longer than the clock would have suggested. "What do you want?" he asked. She set the papers down carefully. "I want to keep teaching. I'm good at it and it matters to me. I want a place to put down roots, real roots, not the kind where you're tolerated until someone decides you should be somewhere else." She paused. "I want someone who is genuinely present, not performing presence. Actually there." "I can do all of that," he said. She looked at him for another long moment, and in the firelight she was absolutely beautiful in the way that had nothing to do with ornament and everything to do with the particular quality of her attention. "I know you can," she said. "That's the problem." "Why is that a problem?" "Because it makes it very difficult," she said carefully, "to maintain any kind of objective perspective on the situation." He smiled then, and it was the kind of smile he did not produce very often, the full one that reached his eyes and changed his whole face. "Miss Quinn," he said, "I believe I am in love with you. I have been for some time, and I'm not going to keep pretending otherwise." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I believe I am in love with you too, Mr. Hartwell. It has been somewhat inconvenient." He laughed. Genuinely freely, the way he rarely did, and she laughed with him, and the fire cracked and the wind outside did its worst and none of it mattered. He kissed her for the first time that evening. Gently, with the specific tenderness of a man who understood the weight of the gesture. And she kissed him back with the same deliberate intention she brought to everything in her life. January became February, and February carried something with it that nobody in Clearwater could yet name. Cornelius Vance arrived. He arrived with Warren and 4 other men, and a lawyer from Kansas City, and he took over the largest room at the Red Ace Saloon, which the owner had smartly converted into something approaching an office, and he began a series of conversations with the town's landowners that had the particular quality of conversations where one person has already decided the outcome. The Vance family, it emerged, had acquired railroad easement rights through a transaction with the territorial government that gave them a legal corridor running through the center of several landholdings around Clearwater. What this meant practically was that they needed those landowners to sell or negotiate passage rights, and the Vance method of negotiation was famously not about finding a number that worked for both parties. It also emerged, through the slow information osmosis of a small town, that Cornelius Vance had something more personal in mind. Perry heard it first from Jake Dunbar, his employer, who had been one of the men called in for a conversation. Dunbar was a practical man and not easily unsettled, but he came back from that meeting with something tightened in his expression. "He wants the Quinn woman," Dunbar said bluntly, sitting across from Perry in the ranch house kitchen. "His son does. Cornelius Vance wants his son to marry well and settle, and apparently he has decided that Alice Quinn is suitable. He told me this as though it were a business detail, as though she were a piece of property to be included in the transaction." Perry felt something very cold and very focused settle into his chest. "He's going to pressure her," Dunbar said, "or pressure the town to pressure her. He controls enough of the area's economic infrastructure to make life uncomfortable for people who get in his way. I'm telling you because you should know, and because you have the look of a man who is going to be in his way." "I am," Perry said. "I know it," Dunbar said. Just be smart about it. He's not a man who responds to direct confrontation. He's a man who works around things. Perry went to see Alice the same evening. She already knew. She had been called to the saloon herself, not by Cornelius but by Mrs. Eleanor Pratt, the storekeeper's wife, who served on the ladies' committee and who had been very carefully enlisted to present the situation in the most reasonable-sounding possible terms. Warren Vance was a good prospect. Cornelius Vance was a powerful man. The town's interests might benefit from the connection. Had Alice given it serious thought, Alice had given Mrs. Pratt a response that was polite and definitive, and she told Perry about it with the flat calm of a woman who had encountered this kind of pressure before and had prepared a response in advance. "He's not going to stop," Perry said. They were in the parlor again, but Mrs. Dunning had made herself scarce with the tactful intuition of a good landlady, and they were alone. "No," Alice agreed. "He won't." Perry stood at the window and looked out at the February street where a cold rain was making the mud worse. "Alice," he said. "Perry." He turned around. "I was going to do this properly. I had a plan. There was going to be more time and better circumstances." She looked at him with the clear attention that always made him feel like she was reading him with great accuracy. "I don't require elaborate circumstances," she said. He crossed the room and sat across from her and took her hands in both of his, which were not soft hands, work-roughened and honest. "I love you," he said. "I want to marry you, not as a response to the Vances and not as a rescue operation. Because you are the most remarkable person I have met in my life and I want to be your husband and build something with you. I'm asking you to marry me." Alice looked at him for a long moment, with the expression she wore when she was being very sure of something. "Yes," she said. "I want to marry you." He let out a breath he had been holding for some time. "And yes," she added, "I know you are not doing this because of the Vances. I know the difference." "How do you know?" "Because you have been building to this for 3 months," she said, "and they have been here for 2 weeks. The arithmetic is not complicated." He smiled. "Will you give me a little time? I want to do this right, a proper arrangement. I want to save enough for a place of our own. I need 3 months, maybe 4. She said yes. They agreed on it. And then Perry Hartwell, not a man prone to public declarations, walked to the Red Ace Saloon and told Cornelius Vance directly and without drama that Alice Quinn was spoken for, and that the Vance family's interest in the matter was finished. Cornelius Vance looked at him with the cool assessment of a man who had been told no before, and had developed very effective methods for converting that no into a yes. "You're a ranch hand," Vance said. "A good one by reputation. But you have no land, no capital, and no prospects that I can identify. Miss Quinn is an intelligent woman. She'll come to her senses." "She has more sense than anyone in this room," Perry said, "and she's made her choice." "We'll see," said Vance. What followed was 3 months of quiet, relentless pressure. Vance did not do anything dramatic or obviously illegal. He was too intelligent for that. He simply rearranged the economic landscape of Clearwater in ways that communicated the cost of defiance. Jake Dunbar found his cattle-buying contract with the Vance operation suddenly unavailable, which cost him a significant portion of his income for the season. Mrs. Dunning was visited by a man from the Railroad Land Office who suggested, very pleasantly, that her property sat on a potential easement corridor and might need to be reassessed. The town council found itself invited to several meetings in Abilene, Kansas, where the Vance Railroad office was located, and came back with the specific unease of men who had been shown a ledger that did not favor them. None of this was directed at Alice specifically. All of it was designed to create an environment in which the people around her would begin to apply their own pressure, because that was how Cornelius Vance worked. He did not need to bully a woman. He simply needed to make everyone around her feel that her choices were expensive. Perry saw it clearly, and it made him furious in the cold, precise way that was more dangerous than heat. He took extra work. Every hour that was not at the Dunbar Ranch was hired out somewhere else. Fence work, horse breaking, hauling, anything that paid. He saved with the focused urgency of a man who understood that time was the variable he could not control. Alice held her ground. She did not waver publicly or privately. She continued teaching, continued her Sunday afternoons with Perry, continued being exactly herself with the kind of resolute calm that Perry found simultaneously inspiring and nerve-wracking, because her equanimity was more deliberate than it appeared. He knew it was costing her. In the evenings when they were alone, he sometimes saw the weight of it in her eyes, the accumulating fatigue of living under observation. She was careful never to show weakness to the town, because she understood that weakness would be interpreted as wavering, and wavering would invite more pressure. "You can tell me when it's hard," he told her one evening in March. "It's hard," she said immediately, and something in her shoulders released slightly. "It's consistently hard. I don't regret any of it, but I'm tired of being watched." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat like that for a while in the lamplight while the March wind worked at the windows. "3 more months," he said, "maybe less. I have enough for a down payment on the Hollies property. You know, the one east of town." She lifted her head. "I know it. It's a good property. It needs work. The house needs considerable work." "I know how to work," she said. He looked at her. "I know you do. That's not the question." "What's the question?" "Are you all right, not strategically, actually?" She thought about it honestly. "I'm all right because you're here," she said. "That's a straightforward, factual statement, not sentiment." "I think," he said, "it can be both." She smiled at that, the full smile that he did not see enough of, the one that made her whole face change and that he had concluded was one of the finest sights available to him. April brought a development that nobody had anticipated. Cornelius Vance made his direct play. He summoned Perry to his office in Abilene. Not requested. Summoned, through a message delivered by a man Perry had never seen before, who handed him a sealed letter at the Dunbar Ranch gate and rode away without conversation. Perry read the letter, which was formal and specific. Cornelius Vance wished to discuss a business matter. He was prepared to make Perry an offer that would resolve all existing difficulties. The meeting was to be Thursday evening at 7 in Vance's office at the Grand Rail Hotel in Abilene. Perry showed the letter to Alice. She read it. Her face was very still. "Don't go," she said. "I think I need to," he said. "I need to know what he's offering so I know what I'm refusing." "Perry," she set the letter down on the table between them. "He's not going to offer you anything you should accept." "I know that," he said. "But if I don't go, he has room to maneuver. If I go, I close the door myself." She was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them made her eyes amber instead of gray-green. "Come back," she said. It was not a request for reassurance. It was specific. She was telling him that the thing she needed from this equation was him returning. The money didn't matter. The deal didn't matter. "Come back." "I will," he said. "I promise." And that was the promise. The one he had made before he rode to Abilene. Not formal, not ceremonial. Just the most important promise he had ever made in his life. The ride to Abilene took 6 hours. He arrived Thursday afternoon and stabled his horse at a livery near the hotel. He ate a meal he did not taste at a restaurant near the station. At 7 o'clock he walked into the Grand Rail Hotel and up to Cornelius Vance's office. The office was everything Clearwater was not. Heavy furniture, good light, a carpet that had cost more than Perry's horse. Maps on the walls, railroad lines drawn in red like veins across the body of the territory. Cornelius Vance behind a desk that could have served as a small dining table, looking exactly like the kind of man who had arranged the room specifically to remind visitors of his scale. Warren Vance was in the corner. He did not speak. He was there as decoration, Perry understood. A reminder of what this was about. "Mr. Hartwell," Vance said. "Sit down." Perry sat. The offer was $50,000. He had not expected a number that size. He had expected something he could dismiss easily, a few thousand, enough to be insulting in its assumption about his price. 50,000 was not insulting. It was astronomical. It was a number designed to be impossible to refuse without significant pain. Perry stared at the envelope on the desk and felt the weight of it in a way that was almost physical. $50,000. A ranch. Real land. The future he had been building toward for 13 years, handed to him in one transaction. All he had to do was disappear, break his promise. Leave Alice Quinn in a town where the entire economic architecture had been arranged to pressure her, where she would eventually be worn down or bought out or simply outlasted. He thought about her face when she had said, "Come back." He thought about 3 months of evenings in the parlor, and the way she laughed when he said something unexpected, and the careful precision with which she had told him about her father reading to her, and the specific quality of her attention when she was really listening to something. He thought about the promise. Not the formal promise yet, they were not yet married, but the one that mattered, the one that had been made in the lamplight with her eyes on him. "I will always show up." He picked up his hat. He stood. He walked out. Now he was on the boardwalk outside the Grand Rail Hotel in Abilene, Kansas, at 7:30 in the evening of a Thursday in April 1875, with the wind off the plains carrying the smell of horses and the distant sound of a badly played piano. He had just turned down $50,000. He felt, with some surprise, absolutely certain. He walked back to the livery, saddled his horse, and rode south through the April dark toward Clearwater, Texas. He arrived at dawn. The town was barely stirring. The livery was just opening. He left his horse and walked directly to Mrs. Dunning's boarding house and knocked. Mrs. Dunning answered in her morning dress, took one look at him and said, "She's in the parlor. She didn't sleep." Alice was sitting in the parlor with a book in her lap that she had clearly not been reading, because it was open to the same page it had been on the night he left, and when she heard the door she was on her feet before he was through it. He crossed the room and she met him halfway, and he held her with the specific relief of a man who had ridden through the dark towards something that mattered. "You came back," she said. "I promised," he said. She was quiet against him for a moment, then she said, "What did he offer?" $50,000. She went very still. He felt it in her. "Perry," she said, pulling back to look at him. "I told him no," he said. "50,000 means nothing," he said. "I know what I want. I've known for 3 months." He held her face between his hands, the calloused, work-honest hands of a man who had built everything he had with them. "I want you and the Hollies' property, and the school that needs chalk and the Spanish verbs you haven't learned yet. I want the whole thing. No amount of money is worth any part of that." She looked at him with eyes that were very bright. "You are," she said slowly, "the most stubborn, unreasonable, wonderful man I have ever met." "I expect you're right," he said. She kissed him. Right there in Mrs. Dunning's parlor at dawn, with the sounds of Clearwater waking up outside, she kissed him with the directness and deliberateness that was entirely her, and he kissed her back with everything he had. Cornelius Vance was not finished, but something had changed after that Thursday night. Vance was a man of calculation. He had offered $50,000 because it was the number he believed should work. The fact that it had not worked told him something about the variables he had miscalculated, and a man like Vance responded to new information by updating his models. He came to Clearwater himself in May, not with the aggressive architecture of his earlier visits. He came quietly with only his lawyer and his son, and he asked to speak with Alice Quinn directly, not through intermediaries. Alice agreed to meet him. She told Perry she was doing this, and he said, "Do you want me there?" "No," she said. "I need him to understand that I am making this decision, not being led to it." He trusted her. That was the whole truth of it. He trusted her completely. The meeting was at the schoolhouse because Alice had chosen the location with the tactical precision that characterized everything she did, her space, her terms. She came back from that meeting with the expression of someone who has done something difficult and done it correctly. "He offered to fund the school," she said, "completely. New building, materials, salary increase, in exchange for ending the engagement and giving Warren a fair consideration." Perry waited. "I told him," Alice said, "that the school's funding should not be conditional on my personal choices, and that if he genuinely wished to support education in this community, he was welcome to do so without any attached conditions, and that his son's personal interests were a matter between his son and whatever woman eventually made an entirely free choice in that direction. But that woman was not me. She sat down across from Perry at the kitchen table of Mrs. Dunning's boarding house. He was quiet for a long time, she said, and then he said that he respected my position. Did he mean it? I think, she said carefully, that he meant it about 50%. Which is more than I expected. The Vances withdrew from Clearwater in late May. Not in defeat exactly, because men like Cornelius Vance did not experience events in those terms, but with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who has determined that the return on investment is insufficient. There was railroad business elsewhere. There were easier transactions. Clearwater was not the only option. Warren Vance rode out of town on a Tuesday morning and did not look back, which was to his credit as far as Perry was concerned. Cornelius stopped at the edge of town and looked at Perry, who was standing outside the livery. "You turned down $50,000, Vance said. "I did," Perry said. "That's either the biggest mistake of your life or the best decision you ever made," Vance said. "I know which one," Perry said. Vance looked at him for a moment with something that might, at a generous angle, have been respect. "I hope she's worth it," he said. "She is," Perry said. "But that's not why I did it. I did it because it was what I promised." Vance rode on without another word. Perry stood in the morning sun for a moment and then went to find Alice. They were married on the 14th of June, 1875, in the Clearwater Church. It was not a grand wedding. There was no money for grand, and neither of them would have wanted it anyway. Mrs. Dunning made Alice a dress from cream-colored cotton lawn that had been ordered from a dry goods store in San Antonio and which was, by any honest accounting, beautiful. Pastor James performed the ceremony with genuine feeling, because he was a man who had watched this particular story unfold over 8 months and considered it among the better ones in his experience. The whole town came. Even Jonas Pratt, who had not entirely forgiven the chalk incident but had developed a grudging respect for Alice's legal precision. The schoolchildren had made paper flowers, which were distributed with tremendous seriousness by Alice's oldest student, a 12-year-old boy named Miguel Torres, whose Spanish had been invaluable to Alice's conjugation practice. Perry stood at the front of the church and watched Alice walk in on the arm of Jake Dunbar, who had agreed to the honor with a gruffness that did not conceal his pride, and he felt the specific quality of happiness that is not loud but is very deep, the kind that reorganizes your understanding of what a life can be. She reached the front and looked at him, and her gray-green eyes were very clear and very certain. "Reinforcements," she said quietly, just to him. He understood. She was not asking to be rescued. She was choosing a partner. The whole thing, all of it, had always been her choice, made freely and with full information, and that was what made it real. "Always," he said, equally quietly. They said their vows, and Perry meant every word, and Alice said hers with the directness that was entirely characteristic of her. And when it was done, and they were outside in the June sun with the whole town around them, and the high plains sky enormous and blue overhead, Perry Hartwell thought about $50,000 and felt nothing about it at all. The Hollies' property was theirs by July. It was a 40-acre parcel east of town with a house that needed significant work, which was not an exaggeration. The roof had 2 soft spots. The kitchen floor was uneven. The well needed the pump mechanism replaced, which Perry found quietly amusing given the circumstances of his first conversation with Alice. The barn was structurally sound but cosmetically unfortunate. They moved in on a Saturday and spent their first night in a house that smelled of old wood and possibility, with mismatched furniture from Mrs. Dunning's surplus, and a bed frame that Perry had built himself from lumber he had been seasoning since February. Alice stood in the kitchen in the evening light and looked around at the cracked plaster and the uneven floor and the window that did not quite close properly and said, "I love this house." "It's a mess," Perry said. "It's ours," she said. "That's different," he smiled. "I'll fix the window tomorrow." "I know you will," she said. "Tonight, sit with me." They sat on the back step in the summer dark and looked at their land, the 40 acres of high plains grass that was theirs, genuinely theirs, and the stars came out over it one by one with the slow certainty of something being built. "Perry," she said, "thank you for the promise, for keeping it." "It wasn't a sacrifice," he said. "I know people will think it was, but it wasn't. You can't sacrifice something you were never going to take." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You knew even then, before you walked in there." "Yes," he said. "I went because I needed to know his price, not because I was considering it." "What if it had been more?" she asked, not challenging, genuinely curious. "It couldn't have been," he said simply. "There isn't a number." She was quiet for a while, and then she said, "I would have been fine, you know. If you had gone, I would have managed." "I know," he said. "You would have been exactly fine. This was never about you needing to be saved." "Then what was it about?" He thought about it. "It was about who I am," he said. "I made a promise. I kept it. That's the whole story." She lifted her head and looked at him with an expression he would remember for the rest of his life. Love, yes, but more specific than that. The look of a person who has found someone who makes sense to them at a fundamental level, whose way of being in the world is comprehensible and good. "That's not the whole story," she said softly. "No," he agreed. "But it's the center of it." She kissed him, and the summer dark wrapped around them, and the 40 acres of high plains grass spread out in every direction, theirs, and the stars continued their business overhead. The first year of their marriage was not easy, not hard either in the ways that mattered. The house was improved progressively and systematically, with Perry's skilled hands addressing each problem in order of urgency. The roof first, then the kitchen floor, then the well pump, which Perry fixed with the specific satisfaction of a man resolving an old joke. The window was replaced with a proper-fitting frame that closed against the winter wind. The barn was painted in late October by Perry and Jake Dunbar, in a joint operation that involved considerable friendly argument about the correct color, and which resulted in a deep red that Alice pronounced perfect. Alice continued teaching. The town's attitude toward her had shifted subtly after the departure of the Vances, because small towns have a way of retrospectively aligning with whoever turned out to be right. And Alice Quinn Hartwell had turned out to be right in a way that reflected well on them by association. Her salary was not what it should have been, but the parents supplemented it in the informal economy of frontier life, with vegetables, labor, and the occasional very good pie. She started a lending library in the back of the schoolhouse, using her own books as the initial collection and soliciting donations from anyone who passed through town with reading material to spare. By spring of their second year, she had 43 volumes and a waiting list. Perry expanded the ranch operation carefully. He bought 6 cattle from Jake Dunbar at a fair price and 3 from a homesteader who was leaving for California and could not take them. He broke horses on contract for several of the surrounding ranches, because his reputation with horses had become specific and considerable, and this supplemented the ranch income through the leaner months. They worked hard. Not desperately, not with the grinding quality of people barely surviving, but with the focused industry of 2 people who had chosen their life and were building it exactly as they wanted it. In the evenings they sat together and read and talked, and Perry continued to help with the Spanish, which had grown from classroom necessity into something that was simply theirs, their private shorthand for a dozen things that were easier to say in borrowed words. In November of their first year, Alice told him she was expecting. He was at the kitchen table cleaning a rifle when she said it, and he set the rifle down so carefully that she laughed a little. "I'm not going to break," she said. "I know," he said. He crossed to her and held her face in his hands the way he always did when something mattered very much. "Are you all right?" "I'm extremely well," she said. "I am, however, quite certain about this, and I thought you should know." He sat back down. He looked at his hands, the rough-worked hands that had turned down $50,000 to come back to this kitchen and this woman and this life. "A family," he said. "That's what I told you I wanted." "I remember," she said. "I was paying attention." He looked up at her, and the emotion on his face was too complete and too honest for him to organize into words, so he simply held out his hands and she took them. Their son was born in July 1876. They named him James after Perry's father's better qualities and after the pastor who had married them. He was a healthy, loud, unambiguous boy who arrived in the world with strong opinions about it, and Alice held him in the July morning, while Perry sat on the edge of the bed and felt something shift in his understanding of what was possible. Mrs. Dunning, who had been invaluable throughout the process, clucked over the baby with the authority of a woman who had seen many children come into the world and considered this one particularly well arranged. "He has your stubbornness," she told Perry. "He has her eyes," Perry said, which was true. The baby had Alice's gray-green eyes and was already looking at everything with a focused attention that Perry found uncanny. The summer James was born was also the summer that a letter arrived from St. Louis. Alice read it at the kitchen table while Perry was in the barn, and when he came in for supper, she handed it to him without preamble. It was from her aunt. The tone was conciliatory in a way that suggested the aunt had been following the story of Alice's life from a distance and had arrived at some conclusions. Gerald Potts, the accountant, had married someone else and moved to Cincinnati. The aunt's own health was not good, and she wrote with the specific vulnerability of a person who has been too proud for too long and has run out of energy for it. She asked how Alice was. She asked carefully if there might ever be a visit. Alice watched Perry read it. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to write back," she said. "She was difficult, but she was also the only family I had for 4 years, and she's not well." "Right," he said. "We'll see what comes of it." What came of it was a slow and halting correspondence that over 2 years became something real, and eventually in the summer of 1878 the aunt came west to visit. She was 61 years old and had never been west of Illinois, and the high plains seemed to alarm her slightly in the way that enormous things alarm people accustomed to smaller scales. But she held James with a tenderness that answered certain questions about her, and she watched Alice in her house and her school and her life with an expression that Perry could only read as something restructuring itself, some old assumption being revised. On the last evening of her visit, she sat on the back step with Perry while Alice put James to bed, and after a silence said, "I was wrong about you." "You didn't know me," Perry said. "I knew enough to make assumptions," she said. "They were wrong assumptions." "What did you assume?" She was quiet for a moment. "That a cowboy with no money was not a serious prospect. That Alice was making a romantic mistake." She paused. "That what she needed was stability, and I was offering it and she was refusing it." "You were offering a version of stability," he said, not unkindly. "She needed a different one." "I can see that," the aunt said. She looked out at the 40 acres in the evening light. "This is a good life she's built." "We built," Perry said gently. "You built," the aunt agreed. "Together. I can see that too." When Alice came out and found them sitting quietly in the evening air, she looked between them with the tactical precision of someone assessing a situation, and then sat down between them with the ease of a woman who has made peace with the complicated business of family and love. In 1877, Perry purchased an additional 20 acres adjacent to the original property, bringing the ranch to 60 acres. He did it with money saved from 3 years of horsework and cattle operations, without any debt, which was a point of quiet pride. The ranch had a name by then. Alice had named it characteristically in a practical way, writing it on the deed application with a directness that had made the land office clerk blink slightly. The Hartwell place. Not poetic. Not pretentious, simply honest. They had a second child in 1879. A girl this time, born in March when the plains were still cold, with Perry's dark hair and a disposition that suggested she had arrived in the world with a clear agenda and was not planning to wait for anyone's permission. They named her Clara after Alice's mother, and she was from the beginning a specific and forceful presence who made James seem, in retrospect, relatively simple. James was 3 years old when Clara was born, old enough to be intensely interested in her in the way of firstborn children who are simultaneously delighted and suspicious about the new development. And he spent a great deal of the first weeks following his sister around with the expression of a small scientist observing an unfamiliar phenomenon. Perry watched his children with a feeling that he could not have predicted and could not fully articulate, not the abstract warmth of anticipated parenthood, but the specific, daily, almost bewildering love of actual parenthood, the love that is woven from 1,000 small and ordinary moments. He thought sometimes about Cornelius Vance's question. Worth it? He looked at his children. He looked at Alice, who was at 31 years old still the most thoroughly herself person he had ever encountered, still teaching, still precise and warm and direct, still occasionally out-arguing Jonas Pratt's son, who had taken over the store, about supply costs and public institution rights, still helping students conjugate Spanish verbs and reading to them from the 43-volume lending library that now had more than 200 books. He could not have articulated an answer that would have made sense to Cornelius Vance, but the answer was yes, unambiguously, entirely, irreversibly yes. In 1880, something happened that nobody in Clearwater had expected. A letter arrived addressed to Perry Hartwell from the law office of a man named Holbrook in Kansas City. It was formal and specific. It contained information about a land patent that had been filed by Perry's father in Missouri before Perry was born, for a 40-acre parcel along the Ozark Hills, which had been tied up in a legal dispute for 30 years and had now been resolved in favor of the Hartwell heirs. The parcel, currently occupied by a tenant farmer who paid nominal rent, was Perry's by law. He sat at the kitchen table with the letter for a long time. Alice read it beside him. She was quiet. "What do you want to do?" she asked. The same question he had asked her 3 years earlier about the letter from her aunt. He thought about it. The Missouri land was worth something. Not enormous, but real. It could be sold. It could, in theory, produce income. "I don't want to go back to Missouri," he said. "You don't have to," she said. "I want to sell it," he said. "Put it toward the Hartwell place. Expand the herd." She was quiet for a moment, reading his face. "Is that all right?" he asked. "Because it was hers too, everything was hers too. I think," she said, "that you should go and see it first before you sell it." He looked at her. "It's where you came from," she said. "That matters. You think I need to go." "I think," she said, "that a man who rides 6 hours through the dark to keep a promise might benefit from making peace with where he learned what promises mean." He was quiet for a long moment. "You know," he said finally, "you are frequently considerably smarter than is entirely comfortable." "I know," she said, not without sympathy. He went to Missouri in the spring of 1880. He was gone for 3 weeks, riding east with 2 horses, and returning with a settled quality that Alice recognized as something resolved. He told her about the land, which was beautiful and foreign to him now, the green hills and the wooded hollows after 5 years of high plains. He told her about standing in the fields his father had worked and feeling something release that he had not known was held. He told her that he had visited his mother's grave, which was in a churchyard near the farm, and that he had stood there for a long time, and that he was glad he had gone. He sold the Missouri land for $400, which went toward a breeding bull that significantly improved the Hartwell herd's quality over the next several years. He did not talk about the Missouri trip often, but it had changed something in him that Alice could see, a slight loosening of something that had been held carefully for a very long time. Their 3rd child was born in 1882, another boy, named Thomas. He had Perry's coloring and Alice's attention, which combination promised to be either very effective or very troublesome or, most likely, both. James was 6 by then and Clara 3. And the house that had needed so much work in 1875 had been expanded twice, and no longer seemed like a project, but simply like home, the specific, lived-in home of a family that had been built carefully and intentionally over years. Perry turned 40 in 1884. He did not observe this particularly, because he was not a man who made production of milestones. But Alice made a dinner that brought the whole community, because Alice had a community now in a way that she had not expected when she stepped off the stage in 1874 with her worn hat and her careful determination. The schoolchildren performed a recitation. Mrs. Dunning, who was 71 and moved more slowly but lost none of her biscuit authority, came and told Perry with brisk affection that she had seen a great many men in her boarding house over 30 years, and he was among the better ones. Jake Dunbar, whose ranch continued well and who had remained a friend through all of it, made a toast that was both accurate and economical. To Perry Hartwell, who turned down more than most of us have ever seen and got more than any of us have ever had. Perry looked at Alice across the table, where she was helping Thomas with something spilled on his shirt, and simultaneously listening to Clara's account of an argument with her schoolteacher that was, knowing Clara, probably merited on both sides, and simultaneously watching Perry with those gray-green eyes that had not changed. He raised his glass. The years moved on the way good years do, with enough difficulty to make them real and enough goodness to make them worth it. James grew into a young man of 15 who was quietly brilliant with mathematics and expressed a serious intention to study engineering, which Alice promoted with the focused intensity of a mother who had always known her children's education was the most important thing she could give them. Clara at 12 was a force of nature who had inherited Perry's stubbornness and Alice's precision, and the result was a girl who was either going to run something significant or considerably complicate the lives of everyone around her, and who Perry privately suspected would do both. Thomas at 5 was still becoming himself, but the attention in his eyes promised something. Perry's horses had become something of a regional reputation. He had developed a careful breeding program over a decade, crossing good working stock with a quarter-horse line he had sourced from a reputable operation in Austin, and the Hartwell horses were known in 3 counties for their temperament and endurance. This was not a fortune, but it was a livelihood that had grown from nothing and belonged entirely to him and Alice and what they had built. In 1888 they received a letter from an unexpected source. It was from Warren Vance. He was living in Denver now, the letter said, working in mining operations, separated entirely from his father's railroad business, which had consolidated and been sold to a larger eastern operation 5 years earlier. He wrote with the specific courtesy of a man who had spent some time thinking about his younger self and was not entirely satisfied with what he found there. He wrote to Alice directly, addressed to Alice Quinn Hartwell, which Perry noticed. In the letter, Warren Vance said that he had thought for a long time about the way things had been handled in Clearwater in 1874 and 1875, and that he had come to understand that his father's methods, and by extension his own participation in them, had been wrong. Not just legally wrong. Wrong in the way that mattered, which was that they had treated Alice Quinn as a problem to be managed rather than a person making her own choices. He said he did not expect a response. He said he was writing because there were things that needed to be said, and he had learned late, but he had learned. He said he hoped they were well. Alice showed the letter to Perry. He read it carefully. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think he grew up," Perry said. "Better late. Should I write back?" He thought about it. "Yes," he said. "What would you say?" "That we are well," she said, "and that I accept the acknowledgement, not forgiveness." "Forgiveness is for things that wounded you permanently," she said. "What he did was an inconvenience. What his father did was an attempt at a hidden trap, a dark scheme with genuine harm intended, but it did not succeed. We were not permanently harmed." She paused. "I have no grievance that requires forgiving, just an experience that needed acknowledging." Perry looked at her with the expression that was particular to moments when she articulated something he had been unable to articulate himself. "Write him back," he said. She did, with her characteristic economy and directness, and the correspondence ended there, amicably and completely, the last thread of that old story finally tied. Cornelius Vance himself had died in 1885. Perry learned through the paper of a heart attack in his Kansas City office. At 68 years old, surrounded by his business empire and without, as far as anyone could tell, having significantly revised his methods in the intervening years. Perry read the obituary and felt nothing in particular, which was its own kind of answer. The summer of 1889 brought a new difficulty, the kind that could not be countered with stubbornness or carefully saved money. Alice became ill in June. It started as a persistent cough, which the summer heat seemed to worsen, and by July she was thinner than she should have been, and there were evenings when Perry could see the fatigue in her that she was working very hard not to show. He brought a doctor from Abilene, because Clearwater's doctor was good, but Perry wanted the best assessment he could get. The doctor from Abilene was thorough and honest. He said it was a lung infection, the kind that required rest and good air and careful management. He said Alice was strong and had come to it early enough. He said that with proper care there was every reason for a full recovery. Perry understood the qualifier in that sentence. He sat with Alice that evening after the children were in bed. James was 19 and away at school in Wichita, studying mathematics with the focused commitment that had always characterized his relationship with numbers. He had been written. Clara, now 17, was home and had taken on the household management with a competence that was simultaneously remarkable and unsurprising. Thomas at 7 required more ordinary supervision. Alice was sitting up in their bed looking out the window at the dark. "I heard what he said," she told Perry. "I know you did." "I'm going to be fine," she said. "I know that too," he said. She looked at him. "You're afraid." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Perry," she reached for his hand. "I'm not going anywhere." "You better not," he said with a flatness that was its own form of emotion. "I promised," she said. He looked at her. "You did not technically promise anything of the sort." "I made a vow," she said, "in the church, in June of 1875. I was quite clear about it. The vow was not specifically about not being ill." "The intent was clear," she said. He looked at her, at this woman who had been the specific organizing principle of his life for 15 years, who argued about school supply costs and taught herself Spanish and raised 3 remarkable children and ran a house and a 100-book lending library and named her own ranch with practical simplicity and loved him with the same directness and intention that she brought to everything. "I'll stay scared," he said, "and you'll get better, both things." "That seems like a reasonable arrangement," she said. He moved her chair out to the back step in the morning so she could be in the good air. He reduced her workload in every way he could manage without insulting her, which required precision, because Alice was not a woman who accepted reduction without noticing it. Clara managed the house with an authority that made Perry wonder where exactly she had learned to run things with that particular combination of warmth and firmness, and then looked at her mother and stopped wondering. By September, Alice was demonstrably better. By October, she was back in the schoolhouse, part-time initially, and by November she was fully herself again, the specific vital quality of her presence restored. Perry sat on the back step the first November evening that she stayed up reading until 10 o'clock with the energy of a healthy person, and he felt something release in his chest that had been held tightly for 4 months. She came out and found him there and sat beside him. "You can stop watching me like that," she said. "Like what?" "Like I might disappear," she said. "I told you I was staying." He put his arm around her. She leaned in. "I know," he said. "I believe you. But I was afraid," he said. "Not because I didn't trust you, because there are some things a promise can't fix." She was quiet for a while. The November stars were out in force, the big cold stars of the high plains winter sky. "Then you hold on to the promise anyway," she said finally. "Not because it can fix everything, because it means that whatever comes, you are not alone in it." He held her closer. "That's what it means," he agreed. James came home from Wichita for Christmas with excellent marks and a classmate he wanted to introduce. A young woman named Sarah from Wichita who was studying to be a nurse, and who met Clara's assessment process with what Perry recognized as exactly the right combination of warmth and backbone. Alice liked her immediately with the directness of her judgment, and Perry liked anyone who could make James, who was 18 now and inclined towards seriousness, laugh the way Sarah did. Christmas of 1889 was a full house in every sense. Perry sat at the head of the table he had built himself from Hartwell lumber in a house he had repaired board by board, and looked at everyone around it, and the accumulation of it all, every choice and every year and every kept promise, sat in him warm and real. Clara, 17, who was already corresponding with a college in Kansas City about the possibility of studying law, because Clara had identified injustice very early and had decided to do something structural about it. Thomas, 7, who had decided he was going to be a rancher, and had said so with the certainty of someone announcing a scientific finding. James, 19, who was making Sarah laugh across the table with a story about his mathematics professor. Alice at the other end of the table, watching all of it with those gray-green eyes. She caught Perry looking and held his gaze for a moment across the full table, across all the years and all the work and all of it, and the expression on her face was the same one he had first seen in the firelight of Mrs. Dunning's parlor on a cold January evening in 1875, the expression of a person who has found something that makes fundamental sense. He raised his glass to her, very slightly, just between them. She raised hers back. The years that followed were the years of building a legacy rather than building a life, because the life was built, the foundation solid and the structure real. James graduated from his engineering program in 1892 and returned to the area, not to Clearwater but to Abilene, where he took a position with a civil engineering firm and brought Sarah with him as his wife, married in a Wichita ceremony that Perry and Alice attended with the specific emotion of parents watching their children begin their own stories. Clara did get to Kansas City. Perry and Alice took her to the stage in 1891 with mixed feelings that were entirely the parental kind, pride and love, and the particular grief of watching a remarkable person go forward into a world that did not yet know what it was getting. She wrote home with regularity, letters full of the specific frustrations and exhilarations of a young woman making her way in a system not designed with her in mind, and Alice read them aloud to Perry in the evenings, with an expression that combined fierce pride with the particular satisfaction of seeing something you planted grow true to its nature. Thomas grew up as he had promised, with the specific love of land and horses that connected him to Perry in a way that was visible to everyone who watched them work together. By the time he was 12, he was a genuine help on the ranch, not in the way of children made to work too young, but in the way of someone who was learning something they genuinely wanted to know. He had Alice's precision and Perry's patience, and what was developing between those two qualities was something very effective. In 1895, Perry turned 51. He was still lean and weathered, the years in them now more visibly, the lines in his face deeper and his hair showing significant gray. But his hands were the same, the honest work-rough hands that had fixed the Clearwater well pump and helped Alice with Spanish verbs and built the furniture in the Hartwell house, and held the hands of 3 children, and turned down $50,000, and come back through the dark to a woman's voice that said come back. Alice was 45 and still teaching, though she had a young assistant teacher now, a woman named Rosa Torres, who was the daughter of Miguel Torres, Alice's first student with the paper flowers at the wedding, and who had been specifically educated in part because of Alice's library and Alice's teaching. Rosa was going to take over the school eventually, and Alice spoke of this with the satisfaction of something planted and grown to its purpose. Their 4th and final child was born in 1893, a surprise to everyone including Perry and Alice, though a welcome one. Another boy named William. He arrived in the world with a full head of dark hair and a considerable opinion about the indignity of being born, expressed at volume, and settled quickly into a placid and curious good nature that made him, in the family assessment, the easiest child they had raised. Perry held William in the spring of 1893, the way he had held James in the summer of 1876, with the specific awe of a man for whom this never became ordinary, the particular weight and warmth of a new person who was partly his and partly Alice's and entirely themselves. "We have 4 children," he said. "I know," Alice said from the bed, with the tone of someone who has just done considerable work and is unimpressed by the observation. "4," he said again. "Perry," she said gently, "hand him to me." He did, and watched her hold William with the ease of experience and the tenderness of someone for whom this was never ordinary either, regardless of how many times. Clearwater by 1896 was not the Clearwater of 1874. The railroad, which the Vances had been trying to bring through 20 years earlier, had come eventually, not through Clearwater but close enough to bring changes. The town had grown. The school had a proper building now, funded eventually by a proper school board with proper public funds, which Alice had sat on the application committee for, with the same precise attention to legal wording that she had brought to the chalk argument in 1874. The Red Ace Saloon was now a general hardware store. Mrs. Dunning's boarding house had passed to her niece when Opal Dunning died peacefully at 80 in 1893, having extracted a promise from Alice to continue the biscuit recipe, which Alice had done with diligent respect for the obligation. The Hartwell place was 120 acres by 1896, expanded 3 times from the original 40, with a solid house and a good barn and a horse breeding operation that was known in the region and a cattle herd that supported the family with room for investment. Perry had done it without the railroad money and without the Vance $50,000, without any fortune except the one he had made himself, and the making of it was entirely the point. One evening in October of 1896, Perry was sitting on the back step in the familiar way, watching the stars come out over his land. He was 52 years old. He had 3 grown children, 2 of them making their own lives, one of them beside him on this land, and one small boy asleep in the house behind him. Alice came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him in the way she always had, easily, naturally, as though the space beside him had always been hers. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the specific silence of 2 people who had been talking for 22 years and had not run out of things to say but understood that not everything needed to be said immediately. "Perry," Alice said, "do you ever think about the money?" He was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes," he said honestly, "not with regret. Just sometimes I think about it the way you think about a road you didn't take. And I imagine riding down that road," he said, "and at the end of it there's money and a ranch and a life, and none of it is this. None of it is you or James or Clara or Thomas or William. None of it is 22 years of evenings on this step." He looked at the stars. "The road to the money goes somewhere, it just goes somewhere else." Alice was quiet beside him. "There isn't a fortune worth this," he said. "There couldn't be. This isn't a sacrifice. This is just the choice I made, and I have known every day since I made it that it was the right one." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in the October night while the stars continued their ancient and indifferent business overhead, and the land spread out around the Hartwell place in every direction, theirs, completely and genuinely theirs, the direct result of a promise made and kept and everything that had followed from it. "Reinforcements," she said quietly, the way she had said it in the church on their wedding day. "Always," he said. The way he had answered then, and would answer for whatever years were left. The coffee was warm in their hands and the night was very clear, and from inside the house came the small, ordinary sounds of a family settled for the evening, and Perry Hartwell sat on the step of the house he had built and held the life he had chosen and felt, in the specific deep and unhurried way of a man who has arrived exactly where he intended, entirely and completely at peace. There was no fortune on earth that could have bought this. He had always known it. He had simply gone to Abilene to prove it. And then he had come back.